Imagine waking up tomorrow and you don't exist anymore. Not your body, that's still there. Not your awareness, you're still conscious, but the you that you think you are, completely gone. Your personality, your life story, your insecurities, your grudges, all vanished. What would be left? According to Buddha, this isn't just some philosophical thought experiment. It's the doorway to the greatest freedom you'll ever experience. What's up, wisdom seekers? Matt here. Today we're diving into Buddhism's most mind-bending teaching, one that flips everything you think you know about yourself upside down. We've touched on non-self in previous videos, but today we're going all in on the big question. What actually happens when you don't exist? Think about it. Every day you wake up thinking you're the same person you were yesterday. You have this story about who you are. Maybe you're the funny one, the responsible one, the anxious one, whatever. You protect this identity at all costs. When someone criticizes you, it hurts because they're attacking the self you've built. But what if this solid, unchanging you doesn't actually exist? What if it's more like a character in a play that you've been performing so long, you forgot you were acting? The Buddha discovered something radical 2,500 years ago that modern neuroscience is only now confirming. This sense of a permanent, separate self is actually an illusion created by our brains. And when this illusion falls away, something absolutely incredible happens. Now, this teaching of non-self, or Anatta in Pali, is one of Buddhism's 3 marks of existence, alongside impermanence, anicca, and suffering, dukkha. These 3 insights form the foundation of the Buddha's revolutionary understanding of reality. While other spiritual traditions were busy describing the eternal soul or unchanging self, the Buddha turned this idea on its head. He taught that seeing through the illusion of a permanent self was the key to liberation from suffering. So for the next 20 minutes, I invite you to hold your sense of self a little more lightly. We're about to explore what shifts, what opens up, and what becomes possible when you don't exist. And trust me, it's way more exciting than it is scary. Let's start with what actually happens in those rare moments when your sense of self temporarily vanishes. Have you ever been so absorbed in something, maybe playing music, or being in nature, or even just watching a sunset, that you completely forgot about yourself? No thoughts about how you look, what you need to do later, or who you are. Just pure experience, with no you at the center of it. As the Zen master Dogen said, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. These are glimpses of non-self, and they happen more often than you might think. Take Alex, a surfer from California who described his experience.
I caught this perfect wave, and suddenly there was no me surfing anymore. There was just surfing happening. Complete oneness with the wave. It was the most peaceful and alive I've ever felt.
This isn't just random. Neuroscientists have found that during these flow states, activity in the part of your brain responsible for self-referential thinking actually drops significantly. Your brain literally stops generating the sense of you for a while. The Buddha put it simply, in seeing, there is just seeing. No seer. Nothing seen. What's fascinating is what people consistently report feeling in these moments. Profound peace, unexpected joy, and a sense of connection to everything. Not the jittery happiness we usually chase like a dog after its tail, but something deeper, like finally remembering a name that's been on the tip of your tongue your entire life. As the famous Zen saying goes, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. But the difference is, there's no you doing the chopping. The Buddha taught that these aren't just nice experiences. They're actually glimpses of our natural state, when the illusion of a separate self temporarily drops away. So what's actually happening in these moments? When you disappear, time perception changes. Everything feels like it's happening in an eternal now. Boundaries dissolve. The line between you and everything else gets very blurry. Fear vanishes because there's no separate self to protect. Effort drops. Things just seem to happen effortlessly through you rather than by you. The contemporary Buddhist teacher Adyashanti describes it perfectly. The greatest miracle is the experiencing of reality devoid of self, completely free of any self-referencing. When that happens, we realize what love is. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if these weren't just fleeting moments? What if this was available as a more stable realization? What if you could function in daily life from this place of no solid self? This is exactly what the Buddhist path is pointing toward. Not just glimpses, but a fundamental shift in how you experience reality. So now that we know what these moments feel like, let's explore the freedom that comes when the prison of self begins to dissolve. Think about how much of your life is spent defending, maintaining, and worrying about this self you think you are. When someone criticizes you, it hurts because they're attacking your self-image. When you compare yourself to others, you're measuring yourself against theirs. When you replay embarrassing moments from years ago at 3 a.m., you're protecting the story of who you think you are. The Buddha called this constant maintenance dukkha, commonly translated as suffering. But it's more like a persistent unease, a background anxiety that never fully goes away as long as there's a you to protect. So what happens when this self disappears? Freedom happens. As Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully put it, to be free of the idea that we are a separate self is the ultimate freedom. Last year I was hiking in the mountains, completely absorbed in work problems. Then a bird call snapped me into the present moment. In that instant, Matt with all his problems vanished. There was just awareness. Experiencing the mountain, the sky, the sound. No separation, just life happening. The relief was incredible, like putting down a heavy backpack I didn't even realize I was carrying. This is what the Buddha was pointing to. When the self disappears, the constant inner critic finally shuts up because there's no you to criticize. Embarrassment fades away because there's no reputation to protect. The need to be special vanishes because there's no you that needs to stand out. The fear of failure dissolves because there's no you that can fail. The 12th century Zen master Dogen wrote, "When you find your place where you are, practice occurs. And your place is precisely where the separate self ends." One participant in our meditation retreat described it this way: "It was like I'd been holding my breath my entire life, and finally exhaled. I realized that what I called me was actually just a collection of thoughts I was desperately clinging to." Neuroscience gives us some interesting insights here too. Studies of experienced meditators show reduced activity in the areas of the brain associated with self-referential thinking, and increased activity in areas associated with awareness and present moment attention. In other words, as the self-construct weakens, awareness actually expands. But here's an important point. This freedom doesn't mean you become an emotional zombie or lose your personality. Actually, quite the opposite. When you're not constantly maintaining a rigid sense of self, you become more spontaneous, more authentic, more alive. Without a fixed self to defend, you're free to respond to each moment freshly, without the burden of how I should be, or what others expect of me. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki explained it perfectly. When you do something, you should burn yourself completely, like a good bonfire, leaving no trace of yourself. So if there's no solid me behind the wheel, what happens when you grab coffee with friends or argue with your partner? That's where things get really interesting. Now let's talk about something we all care about: relationships. What happens to your connections with others when you don't exist? Think about the last argument you had with someone close to you. Chances are it revolved around defending your position, your feelings, your perspective. You hurt me. You don't understand my needs. You don't appreciate what I do for you. What if all those me's and my's were suddenly not so solid? When non-self is realized, relationships transform in remarkable ways. As the Buddha taught, just as a mother would protect her only child at the risk of her own life, let one cultivate a boundless heart towards all beings. First, comparison and competition naturally fade away. When there's no solid you to compare with others, the exhausting game of one-upmanship ends. You no longer need to be prettier, smarter, wealthier, or more successful than others, because there's no separate you that needs to win. Jason, a longtime meditator, shared this experience.
After years of fighting with my brother over who was more successful, something shifted. During one family gathering, I realized there was no me that needed to prove anything. Our whole rivalry just dissolved. Now we're closer than ever.
Second, genuine empathy naturally arises. Without the barrier of a separate self, you directly experience others' joy and suffering as not separate from your own. Compassion becomes less of an effort and more of a natural response. The Dalai Lama explains it this way: love and compassion are necessities, not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive. Third, relationships become less needy. When you're not looking to others to complete your sense of self or validate your existence, connections become more authentic and less burdened. Think about this. How many of your relationship problems stem from seeking validation, recognition, or completion from others? What if you approached relationships without needing anything from them, just showing up fully present? Research in psychology confirms this. Studies show that the strongest relationships aren't based on dependency or completing each other, but on two whole people choosing to share their journey. Fourth, conflicts transform. When there's no me to defend, disagreements stop being personal. You can disagree with someone without making them wrong and you right. You can even incorporate their perspective into your understanding, creating something new together. As Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, in true dialogue, both sides are willing to change. This doesn't mean you become a doormat or lose your boundaries. Actually, boundaries become clearer and healthier, because they're no longer emotionally charged defenses of a fragile self. They're just practical parameters for interaction. But wait, if there's no me running the show, who's going to remember to pick up the dry cleaning? Who's going to show up for work on Monday? Let's get practical about this whole no-self business. Now I know what you're thinking. This all sounds nice in theory, Matt, but how does this actually work in real life? Who gets up and goes to work if there's no me? Who makes decisions? Who takes responsibility? These are great questions, and they bring us to the practical side of non-self. The common misconception is that without a self, you just sit around doing nothing, or float aimlessly through life with no direction. But that's not at all what happens. As the Zen master Linji put it, when hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. The profound simplicity of this teaching points to action without the complication of a self-centered narrative. The difference is in the who that's doing the action, or more accurately, the absence of a who. So what does this actually look like on a Tuesday morning when you're stuck in traffic? Your life continues, but without that extra layer of meannesses clogging everything up. Decisions still happen, but they arise from wisdom and conditions rather than ego preferences. Responsibilities are still fulfilled, often more effectively, because there's no self-centered resistance to them. Goals can still be pursued, but without the desperate attachment to outcomes. The Buddha himself was incredibly active after his enlightenment, teaching for 45 years, establishing a monastic order, traveling extensively. Clearly, function doesn't stop when self dissolves. Neuroscience gives us interesting insights here too. Studies show that when experienced meditators perform tasks from a state of non-self, their performance often improves. There's less second-guessing, less performance anxiety, and more direct engagement with the task at hand. Think about athletes in the zone, or musicians who become one with their instrument. They're functioning at their peak precisely when the self steps out of the way. as the legendary basketball coach Phil Jackson, who incorporated Zen teachings into his coaching, said, "The key to success is non-attachment and being fully present." But what about morality? If there's no me, what prevents harmful actions? This is where many people misunderstand non-self. The realization of non-self doesn't eliminate ethics, it transforms them. When you don't see yourself as separate from others, causing harm makes less and less sense. Compassionate action emerges naturally, not because you should be good, but because you directly experience others' suffering as not separate from your own. The 8th century Buddhist master Shantideva put it beautifully. Whatever joy there is in this world, all comes from desiring others to be happy, and whatever suffering there is in this world, all comes from desiring myself to be happy. So in practical terms, living from non-self might look like working diligently, but without identifying as the hard-working one, loving deeply, but without possessiveness or need, creating art or music, but without needing recognition, helping others, without seeing them as separate from yourself. It's not that personality disappears, it's more that you hold it lightly, like a costume you can wear wholeheartedly without forgetting you can take it off. You see your personality in the mirror of everyday life, but you no longer mistake the reflection for who's doing the looking. You wear your identity like an interesting mask at a party, fully engaged in the character, but secretly smiling at the game of it all. Okay, so we can still function without a solid me. Great. But the Buddha wasn't teaching this just so we could be more effective at our jobs. He was pointing to something much bigger. We've talked about glimpses of non-self, the freedom it brings, how it transforms relationships, and how it works practically. But now let's explore what the Buddha considered the ultimate purpose of this teaching: complete liberation. The Buddha didn't teach non-self as an interesting philosophical concept. He taught it as medicine for the fundamental disease of human existence, suffering. He recognized that at the root of all our suffering lies this mistaken belief in a separate, permanent self. And when this illusion is completely seen through, something profound happens. In Buddhist terminology, this complete liberation is called nirvana, literally meaning blowing out, like a flame being extinguished. But what's being extinguished isn't you. It's the illusion of a separate self. It's like you've been wearing noise-canceling headphones your entire life, and suddenly they're removed. The world explodes into symphonic clarity that was always there. As the Buddha said, the extinction of desire, the extinction of hate, the extinction of delusion. This indeed is called nibbana, nirvana. So what actually changes when this ultimate liberation occurs? First, fear, especially fear of death, dramatically transforms. When you deeply realize there was never a permanent you to begin with, the terror of losing this you naturally subsides. Death is still respected, but it's seen more as a transition than an end. The Tibetan Buddhist master, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, explained, "The everyday practice is simply to develop complete acceptance and openness to all situations and emotions, and to all people, experiencing everything totally without reservations or barriers." Second, suffering takes on a completely different quality. The Buddha never claimed that physical pain would disappear with enlightenment, but he did teach that the mental suffering we add to our experience, the resistance, the aversion, the craving, can completely cease. Imagine experiencing life's challenges without the added layer of, "Why is this happening to me? I don't deserve this." Dr. Mark Epstein, a psychiatrist who integrates Buddhist thinking with psychology, describes it as the freedom to be nobody. There's an incredible lightness in not having to be somebody special all the time. Third, a natural joy emerges. Not the excited, grasping happiness we usually chase, but a profound contentment that's always available, regardless of external circumstances. The Thai forest master Ajahn Chah called it the peace that comes from letting go. Fourth, perception itself fundamentally shifts. The world doesn't change, but how you experience it transforms completely. Instead of seeing separate objects and people, you directly perceive the interconnected nature of everything. Boundaries become permeable, fluid, more like convenient designations than ultimate realities. The contemporary teacher, Adyashanti, describes it as the end of your world, not in an apocalyptic sense, but in the sense that the world, as you've constructed it, falls away, revealing what was always here. But perhaps the most significant shift is this: the seeking finally stops. The constant feeling that something is missing, that you need to become something more. That fulfillment is around the next corner, comes to an end. As the ancient Chan master Linji said, "There is nothing I dislike." And yet, if the world is only studied in a certain way, this is called being ridden by things. The teacher delivered to the world is able to turn things around. When environment comes, he turns it around. This is turning things around. This doesn't mean you become passive or complacent. Quite the opposite. Without the self-centered filters, you're able to respond to life directly, spontaneously, compassionately, without the hesitation and confusion that comes from self-concern. So what does all this mean for you, watching this right now? It means that this freedom, this peace, this clarity isn't something distant or theoretical. It's your birthright. It's what you already are, when the illusion of a separate self falls away. As the Buddha said in his final teaching, "Be a light unto yourself." So now, let's wrap this all up with a mystery that might just change everything. So we've explored what happens when you don't exist. We've seen how the self is more like a process than a thing, how freedom emerges when this illusion is seen through, how relationships transform, how we can function practically, and the ultimate liberation this points toward. But here's the cosmic joke that the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree. The self spends its entire existence desperately trying to protect itself from something that never happens, because that self never truly existed in the first place. It's like spending your life afraid of monsters under the bed, and then one day, finally looking underneath, only to discover there was never anything there. This leaves us with a profound mystery. If you're not who you think you are, then what's really living this life? If you're not your thoughts, they come and go while awareness remains. If you're not your emotions, they change constantly while awareness watches. If you're not your body, every cell is replaced over time. If you're not your memories or life story, which change and fade, then what are you? The answer can't be put into words, because words and concepts are tools of the thinking mind. And this mystery lies beyond thinking. It can only be discovered through direct experience, by looking deeply into the nature of your own awareness. As the great Zen master Huineng said, "From the beginning, not a thing is." This isn't nihilism. It's not saying nothing exists. It's pointing to a profound reality beyond our conceptual frameworks, beyond the stories we tell about ourselves. The invitation of Buddhism isn't to believe in non-self as a concept, but to investigate your direct experience right now. To look deeply into this sense of I and see what's really there. The Zen tradition calls this the Great Death, not the death of the body, but the death of the illusion of a separate self. And what's discovered through this great death is what some traditions call your original face, what you were before you were born, what you've always been beneath the costumes and masks of identity. I invite you to get curious about this, to wonder, to investigate, not intellectually, but experientially. What if you didn't have to wait for enlightenment to experience freedom? What if you could taste it right now? By simply pausing and noticing that awareness which is already present, already complete, already free of a separate self. Because when the illusion of you falls away, you stop surviving and start being. You stop performing and start living. As the contemporary teacher Rupert Spira puts it, awareness is not something we have, it is what we are. And with that, I invite you to sit quietly for a moment. Close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so, and simply notice who or what is aware of your current experience. Not what you're aware of, but what is this awareness itself? And I'll leave you with that question to explore in your own time, because that exploration is the heart of the Buddhist path. Have you ever experienced a moment when you disappeared? Share in the comments below. I read every single one and would love to hear about your experiences. And remember, the next time you find yourself stressed, anxious, or caught in self-concern, just pause and ask yourself, what happens when I don't exist? You might be surprised at the freedom that question opens up. Until next time, stay curious, stay wise, and remember, you might be less you than you think. And that's the best news you'll ever receive.